Hello, my name is Michael Herrick. I'm a psychotherapist and a life coach in private practice in London. In this video, I'll talk about something I call mindful thinking. We've all heard about mindfulness, and many have adopted mindfulness practices. This could be through meditation or an app that offers various kinds of mindfulness exercises. As someone who's studied and practiced mindfulness for nearly 50 years, I have no doubt about its benefits. I'm a big fan of it, both for my personal life and also professionally. At the same time, I've come to realize that it has limitations. If you've tried mindfulness practices and they didn't work for you, or if you're practicing mindfulness but have an intuition that it just isn't doing as much for you as you had hoped, I'll suggest why that might be so. It has to do with its relationship with thinking. But before I explain what I mean by this, I want to tell you my personal story. In terms of beginning on a path of mindfulness, it started 50 years ago for me. In 1974, at the age of 19, I had a powerful, spontaneous, life-transforming experience. I later learned that it can be called a satori, but I had no idea about this at the time. I'd never heard or read about anything remotely like my experience. The simple way to describe it is that I suddenly saw and felt vividly, before and beyond any intellectual idea, that my whole concept and experience of having and being a self was an utter illusion. I didn't know how to talk about it. As it had come from a deep contemplation of my own death, the best I could say is nothing happens when you die, meaning there is no self that dies. After a few months, I tried to describe this experience and insight to a woman who was a bit older than me. She suggested that I read the work of Alan Watts, so I did. To my surprise, it turned out that I wasn't the first person in the history of humanity to have this experience. Apparently, the 2,500-year tradition of Buddhism was built on it. By 1976, I connected with a Buddhist meditation group under the Tibetan Buddhist teacher Chogyam Trungpa. I'd found a way to keep my realization in my awareness and explore its profound implications for my life. Fast forward to 1982. I enrolled in a program that was then called Buddhist and Western Psychology at the Naropa Institute in Boulder, Colorado. Naropa is now a university, and that program is now called Contemplative Psychotherapy. It's a clinical program that prepares students for doing therapeutic work. After our first year of academic study, the class convened for 3 months at a Buddhist retreat center in the Colorado Rockies. We lived together and meditated extensively and did other contemplative practices. Amid this, we had group process meetings for sharing and discussing our experiences. I graduated from that program in 1984, and in 1985 I attended a 3-month Buddhist seminary at the same retreat center. Another relevant part of my story, in terms of how I've come to think about mindfulness, is that my first job in the mental health field was on the acute unit of a psychiatric hospital from 1980 to 1988. In the course of my career over the past 44 years, half of those years have involved working with people with serious mental health issues. This has led me to look for and value practical and effective means for restoring sanity to the mind. Back in the 80s, mindfulness was not a household word. It was pretty much fringe and not considered to be a serious way to address mental health issues. Talking about it among other professionals who hadn't really looked into it could earn you a reputation for being flaky and captured by esoteric spirituality. As the decades have unfolded since the 80s, mindfulness has become increasingly recognized as a legitimate approach for dealing with a wide range of issues, from pain management to stress reduction, emotional regulation, better physical health, enhanced relationships, and overall well-being. Cognitive behavioral therapy has also taken it up, so that now we have what's called mindfulness-based CBT. What was once fringe is now mainstream. While the popularization of mindfulness has been widely celebrated by practitioners from the early days, many have been critical. It seems to them that the fundamental purpose for a path of mindfulness meditation has been lost. Instead of it being a spiritual path aimed at enlightenment or liberation from the illusory prison of the ego, It has become a tool used for the preservation and enhancement of the ego. Its deep roots have been cut off and forsaken, and it has become trivialized, commodified, and commercialized to serve a different goal. Is this true? Has mindfulness gotten off the track and taken a problematic detour? We could also ask if mindfulness in its current popularized form is even insufficient for addressing the range of psychological problems that people confront. These are the questions I'll explore in this video. Maybe it has veered from its deeper spiritual roots, and maybe it doesn't sufficiently address the many problems that challenge human beings. Maybe it isn't enough to simply realize you don't exist and that your thoughts are only thoughts. If you don't exist, then who is having the problems? No one. Problem solved. This can be a clever escape, but it doesn't work except for fleeting moments on the meditation cushion. It can also set you on a path of spiritual bypassing, like me, for decades. Additionally, for those seeking a path that allows them to transcend their ego, popular versions of mindfulness are likewise inadequate. Let's now look at the basic premise of mindfulness. The generally accepted definition is that it is a non-judgmental awareness of what arises in the present moment. Thoughts, feelings, sensations, and sense perceptions arise and disappear in our awareness. Mindfulness says, simply notice whatever arises. Don't evaluate it as good, bad, better, or worse. Just notice it and come back to the present moment. Don't dwell in the past or the future. Anchor your awareness in the present by bringing your attention to the immediacy of your breath, for instance, in the formal practice of meditation. So, what happens if we practice this diligently over time? Some very good things do happen. We develop the ability to notice more about our interior world. We notice our thoughts and feelings. By simply noticing them and returning to the breath, we develop a sense that our self is not the contents of our thoughts. We begin to identify instead with a naked witnessing awareness of those thoughts and feelings. We learn how to let them go, and so spare ourselves the angst and anxiety that they tend to produce. We find some sense of peace. We differentiate our metacognitive function from all of the busyness of our restless minds. This allows us to not be captured and hijacked by our patterns of thinking. Anxiety can be reduced. This is like a superpower. We don't have to fall prey to the moods generated by mindless ruminations on negative thoughts. We don't have to submit to compulsive behaviors suggested by the patterns of our thoughts and feelings. This is what mindfulness-based cognitive behavioral therapy discovered. And it ain't nothing. If you're liking this video so far, please give it a like. And if you aren't already subscribed, please do. And click the bell for notifications. I'm approaching the 1,000 subscribers mark, which will allow this channel to be monetized. Although that isn't why I'm doing this, it would help. And your support will be greatly appreciated. Thanks. Back to our topic. So, what is missing in mindfulness? In addition to mindfulness of thinking, I believe we need mindful thinking. I'll explain what I mean, but first I want to say that the latter presupposes the former and depends upon it. We must first differentiate, recognize, and identify with our witnessing awareness. Simply put, we have to notice our thinking and feeling before we can do anything about it. But after we do notice, we need to apply another level of thinking that does judge and evaluate those thoughts and feelings. We might also call this thinking about thinking. In the context of having to actually live our lives, it turns out that some thoughts are better and some are worse. Some feelings match circumstances and motivate useful action, and some don't. But in order to have any discernment or discriminating awareness, we require some reference points. In the language of acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, a version of mindfulness-based CBT, we need to clarify our values and goals. To do this, we can't be captured by the thoughts of extreme postmodernism or the spiritual bypassing of believing that since we don't exist, it doesn't matter. Nihilism won't cut it, and neither will simply noticing our thoughts and feelings. we have to think and feel our way toward clarifying our values and goals before we can meaningfully evaluate our thoughts and feelings. As paradoxical as this metacognition sounds, really it's the only way. The first thing that we might do in terms of mindful thinking is notice and think about where we direct our attention. Things don't simply arise for us to notice non-judgmentally. We're not just a passive audience for what appears in our awareness. We're active in selecting what appears. We can ask ourselves some questions about this. Externally, what do we focus on in our environment? What local and world events capture our attention? Who do we give our attention to? Do we respond to bids for attention from others, including our partner? Internally, what thoughts and feelings do we focus on, dwell on? What are our cognitive biases? What externally and internally do we ignore? How do our beliefs filter what we can even be aware of? We can notice our noticing and think about it in terms of our values and goals. We can set intentions for what is more or less important and useful to pay attention to. We can't have absolute control over our attention, nor would that be a good thing. But we can have some control. Unexpected, important things may present themselves, and we need to have some flexibility. But we all know that we waste time paying attention to things that are not that important and don't serve us or anybody else. Let's examine the mindfulness injunction to live in the present moment. This is generally good advice for when we're checked out or dissociated from what's going on around or within us. And while it's philosophically interesting to contemplate the existence of time and attempt to live in the so-called present moment, what does that really mean? Are we to not think about the past or the future? Is that even possible? The present moment is populated not just with immediate sense perceptions, but with memories and anticipations, without which we cannot function and live. We would forget where we live and work, who our family members and friends are, how to do basic tasks, and be incapable of planning anything. We would only be able to have the most reflexive actions to immediate events. Our lives would be utter chaos, and we would not be enlightened, as we might like to imagine. It would be more like having Alzheimer's. I've heard it said that if this was true, we would need enlightenment wards in hospitals. The question then is, how does mindful thinking relate to the past and the future? First, it recognizes that whatever it thinks, including about the past and the future, it happens in the present. Okay, fine. But it goes further. It considers memories of the past in terms of learning. It asks, what was the consequence of what I said or did, or what happened in the past? Was that desirable or problematic in terms of my values and goals? It doesn't just relieve a sense of guilt, shame, regret, or responsibility by detaching from and dissociating from those thoughts and feelings. It evaluates them. Are they accurate and fair? If they aren't, let them go. If they are, set an intention for the future. Figure out something better, which takes more thinking, and commit to speech and action that is better aligned with your values and goals, and more likely to bring you closer to a desired future. I won't get into a full exploration of reason and logic, but these are fundamental to mindful thinking. I'll just say a few things. Thinking about thinking first evaluates whether our thoughts correspond to reality. Is there any real evidence that substantiates our thoughts, feelings, and beliefs? It also assesses the potential usefulness of certain thoughts, imagines the kinds of actions that follow from them, and the likely outcomes of different actions. To do this, we have to understand cause and effect relationships and extend them theoretically over time into the future. None of this happens if we just notice and let go of our thoughts and rivet our attention to the present moment. The reality is that we're going to think and do things no matter how much we meditate. Mindful thinking allows us to learn from our successes and mistakes and fashion a path forward. Mindfulness alone cannot do this. We also need mindful thinking. Another thing that mindful thinking can do is imagine alternative interpretations for the same event. We create stories or narratives to make sense of the world and ourselves. Some are better and some are worse in the context of our ability to function, notice and take advantage of opportunities, resolve conflicts with others, and ultimately live a satisfying life aligned with our values and goals. I remember hearing many times in my early days of mindfulness training, drop the storyline. Well, this is a good first step toward metacognition. The next step is to make a better storyline. The simple fact is that narratives are how we make sense of the world, and we can't function if we don't make any sense of things. As a therapist, I've found mindfulness to be a useful tool, and I frequently talk about it with clients. Over time, however, I've observed that by itself it's inadequate to meet their needs. It's also inadequate for me. We need something more than mindfulness itself to offer. I think we need to recognize that the roots of mindfulness were more oriented to transpersonal levels of development. For those who have an adequate level of mindful thinking and have traversed the rocky road to becoming someone and living life in a stable way, it can be just what is needed. It's a powerful tool for transcending the ego. This brings me to another way to understand mindfulness, mindful thinking, and the relationship to each other, a developmental perspective. To keep this simple, I'll just be talking about two major stages, personal and transpersonal. Each of these have extensive substages, but I won't be getting into that here. The origins of mindfulness and Buddhist meditation practice are ultimately aimed at transpersonal development, or awareness and experience that transcends the ego and identification with a skin-encapsulated self. For the beginning student practitioner, the Hinayana path and tradition is about cultivating peace of mind or sense of tranquility and equanimity. This makes the personal stage less troubling and problematic. One trains in having a proper relationship with one's thoughts and feelings, allowing them to arise and pass away without attachment to them. This is the level at which popularized Western versions of mindfulness are taught and practiced. It's useful, but it does not provide adequate means for addressing more serious psychological distress and dysfunction. It turns out that Western knowledge of psychology and its plethora of therapeutic means for treating psychological issues offers valuable insights and tools that the Buddha didn't know about, nor perhaps did the Buddha have to confront the many complexities, neuroses, and dysfunctions that have been spawned by the modern and postmodern age. Part of what I believe needs to be added to mindfulness at the personal stage, as I've been suggesting, is mindful thinking. If the early Hinayana practitioners had been as neurotic and disturbed as us, it would have been helpful for them too. Beyond the Hinayana, there's Mahayana Buddhism. Mahayana teachings are rich and vast, but I want to just point out that it's at this stage in the Buddhist path that the idea of emptiness or no self is taught. Along with this is the ethical path of the Bodhisattva and the cultivation of compassion for all beings. This includes the 6 paramitas of generosity, discipline, patience, effort, concentration, and wisdom. Values and virtues are a vital part of the Buddhist path, but the central insight is about transpersonal awareness and the empty, illusory nature of the self and the world. You can't think your way to enlightenment. You have to see and experience it directly. In fact, you can't get there at all. Recognition of shunyata or emptiness is an awareness of the fleeting, impermanent nature of all thoughts as they arise out of emptiness and return to it. This includes any thoughts assembled to create an illusion of self. Such an awareness exists outside or beyond the flow of time. It plans and schemes nothing. It seeks to change nothing. It dwells in the self-evident, self-sufficient, perfect, complete, eternal now. Ultimately, this is what is meant to be awakened through mindfulness meditation, the noticing without judgment of whatever arises in consciousness and letting it go. Or, as the Tibetan Buddhist teacher Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche has said, good, bad, happy and sad, all thoughts vanish into emptiness like the imprint of a bird on the sky. Does this sound like a sufficient strategy for choosing a livelihood, coping with social anxiety, managing PTSD, navigating the dating scene and finding a partner, negotiating and resolving conflicts, deciding where to live, and so forth? Basic mindfulness is a good start and maybe even necessary, but unless you want to install yourself in a monastery and cut off from the hubbub of the world, you're going to need more. While Buddhism advises us to notice and let go of thinking, it seems there is still quite a lot of thinking required along the way. Earlier, I commented on how early adopters of mindfulness have been critical of how popularized versions don't address its ultimate transpersonal purpose. It can also be critiqued for not including Buddhism's ethical framework. Buddhism has its own way of addressing what I'm calling mindful thinking. It does this by proposing values and goals that guide practitioners in their lives. Remember, this is the first step to mindful thinking. In addition to the 6 paramitas already mentioned, there's also the Eightfold Path that starts with Hinayana and continues into the Mahayana Buddhist path. It includes right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. As an early adopter myself, I understand and agree with the critique. At the same time, I appreciate that when presented as a religion with its own prepackaged values and goals, mindfulness is not likely to be attractive to the general public. It has had to be presented in terms of what makes sense to the average person experiencing psychological distress. Acceptance and commitment therapy doesn't have the downside of telling clients what values and goals they should have. It encourages and supports them toward discovering these for themselves, which makes it more accessible. It's not surprising that cognitive behavioral therapy took up mindfulness and added its own understanding of what it takes for the mind to function effectively. This has made mindfulness more useful for navigating the challenges and demands of lived life at the personal stage of development. It also avoids telling people what they ought to value. While it doesn't address or facilitate the transpersonal stage, that's not its aim. In Tibetan Buddhism, one starts with Hinayana, the small vehicle, or narrow path. When the student is ready, Mahayana teachings are presented. This is called the great vehicle. When a practitioner is sufficiently grounded in the Hinayana and Mahayana teachings, Vajrayana teachings are offered. Vajrayana means the diamond or indestructible way. These are teachings and practices aimed directly at the transpersonal stage of development. It is said that without having first mastered Hinayana and Mahayana, Vajrayana is SelfSecret. This means that you can't even understand it if you're told about it. It's also said to be very dangerous to try to practice it without proper foundation in Hinayana and Mahayana. Just like mindfulness, people have popularized Tantra, another word for Vajrayana, and made it available to anyone who can pay for a weekend workshop. That might be a topic for a whole other video. Right now, however, I just want to point out a central insight that comes from Vajrayana. It's called non-duality. This means that the pure, naked witnessing awareness is not separate from all that it witnesses. This includes all egoic thoughts and feelings, which are no longer seen as problematic or something to fight against or transcend. Everything in one's experience is included. It's sometimes called one taste. When presenting Vajrayana teachings, my own teacher, Chogyam Trungpa, would repeatedly say, "Never forget Hinayana." Vajrayana blossoms out of what has come before. Try to imagine for a moment the radical realization of non-dual awareness or one taste if it's not first grounded in a path of discipline and ethics. It makes me think of what happens when a radical postmodern view is adopted. Vajrayana appreciates the value of mindful thinking and doesn't reject it as somehow falling short of environment. This might be part of why it could be dangerous to practice it without foundational preparation. You might latch onto a belief without recognizing it, that all such thinking is to be eliminated. This is where so-called crazy wisdom is just plain crazy. So my point is that both mindfulness and mindful thinking play their parts in the personal and the transpersonal stages of development. I don't believe that mindfulness ought to be reserved for transpersonal development. It has plenty of utility for personal development, and not everyone is interested or ready for transpersonal. But wherever mindfulness finds a use, I believe it needs to work in tandem with mindful thinking. If you're practicing mindfulness or considering it, I encourage you to carry on. Just know that to get the most benefit from it, you will need to further develop your metacognition. You will need to go beyond just noticing and letting go of your thoughts and feelings and apply mindful thinking in the ways I've described. Well, this is a good place to stop. Until next time, take care of yourself and each other, and maybe some mindful thinking will lead you to a clearer sense of what that could entail. Bye for now.